morning. They're very, very easy. Reject, accept, and pretend. All three of those words are really found there in that verse. That we are to indeed to reject those things that are evil. We are to be accepting of those things that are good. And we're not to be pretending about those things, not play acting. One of the things that gets us in trouble as Christians sometimes is that we play act. We pretend that we hate what's evil, and we pretend to love those things that are good. We pretend that we're going to say no to all these bad things in the world. However, when we're put to the test, we end up accepting them. There's things which are good that may not be what's in our best interest in some kind of way, and instead of saying, and we may say that we're going to accept those things, but in actuality we don't. And so that is what Paul's idea is in this verse. If you look down later in Romans chapter 12, verse 21, he says, do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. If we are going to be able to defeat evil, it has to be with good, not pretending that we hate it, not pretending or in front of other people acting like we don't like it, but actually doing those things that show that we hate, detest those things that are evil and cling to what is good. Clinging to what is good, making ourselves a spouse to it, joining ourselves to it fully is the thing that defeats evil. And this begins, as he has at the beginning of chapter 12, we have to change the way that we think. It starts with the mind, not conforming ourselves to the world, but being transformed by the renewing of our minds. This goes along with the theme that makes us more like God. God is one who loves what is good, and he hates what is evil. So what does it mean, though? When we think about that word abhor, it's not a word that we use a lot. The definition, you've probably heard this many other times, it means to hate or to loathe. Some of your versions even may have the word hate, those things that are evil, to hate, loathe, or detest. The thing about this word abhor that makes it unique is that you hate it not just because you detest it and don't like it, but there's a horror that's attached to it. Think of it this way. It's about, if you don't like snakes, if you're afraid of snakes, you hate snakes because you're afraid of them, and you're afraid of them because you hate them. And this is something that you don't pretend about either. And this is something that there's no appearance of it. There's nothing that's similar to it that you're going to like. I've always heard it this way. I don't like live snakes, dead snakes, or sticks that look like snakes, because all of those things would be things that would scare me. And because of that, that's what abhor means. It means coming upon a dead body, basically, and how you would react if you were to see something like that, how detestable that would be, how horrifying that would be. That's what abhor means when Paul is using it here to talk about those things that are evil. It's used in the present tense, which means it's not something that you do once and then you're done with it. It's something that is an ongoing process. Keep on abhorring those things that are evil, because you're going to constantly be coming upon things that are evil. And because of that, this is about a lifestyle and not just about one decision that was made. And so when you turn to a passage like Galatians 5, 19 through 21, and this is one of many lists you have in the Scriptures about some of those things which God hates, which are things which are detestable, which things that are evil. And when you look at those things, they could be broken down into several different categories as well. But in Galatians 5, it talks about the works of the flesh as opposed to walking by the Spirit. Galatians 5:19 says, now the works of the flesh are evident: adultery, fornication, uncleanness, lewdness. All these things have to do with sexual sins. Idolatry, sorcery. These things have to do with things that take the place of God. You have hatred, contentions, jealousies, outbursts of wrath, selfish ambitions, dissensions. These are things that have to do with our relationships with other people. Heresies, envy, murders, drunkenness, revelries, and the like. All these things have to do with those things that God considers are evil. And so God says, don't just not do those things, because understand something plainly. You cannot participate in any of those things, but it does not mean you hate them. You can refrain from doing those things, but it does not mean that you hate them. You cannot do those things, but it does not mean you're terrified of them. You cannot do those things because you're pretending to love God. Love without hypocrisy is to abhor what is evil. And that's why Paul says, and the like. Those who do such things as this are not going to inherit the kingdom of God. And the reason that you would participate in those things is obviously because you don't hate them and because you're not terrified of them. You don't detest them. But if you hate them and you detest them, then anything that is like that, the sticks that look like snakes, you would also hate that and detest that and be terrified by that. That's why, brethren, we have to be so very careful about this idea. Well, the Bible doesn't tell me not to. Well, the Bible does command you to not do anything that's like that. And that is something that is plain, which means that if you love God without hypocrisy, you're not going to violate that principle. And we all know when we come too close to that, you can't take fire to your bosom and not be burned by it. A person's going to reap whatever it is they sow. And so if you're going to sow to the flesh and advocate these types of things or the things that are like them, it's going to get you into trouble each and every time. So that's what it means to abhor. And this is something that's not just required for our salvation, because it is there, but it's also so that we might be growing and also enduring and making it through life. James 1, as we looked at in our class this morning, we are to remove all filthiness and overflow of wickedness, so that we might receive with meekness the implanted word. If I understand that word correctly, one commentator was talking about the overflow of wickedness. The word that is used there is used of something that is filthy, as something that is dirty and unclean. But what it was most commonly used for, according to this one commentary, was earwax. Now that earwax is built up so much that it has to be almost removed by a doctor. And so when James is using it, it may possibly be that he's using it in this sense. You need to get that earwax surgically removed from your body so that you can receive with meekness receive with meekness the implanted word which is able to save your soul. But to abhor those things, I don't want that. How do you feel about earwax? Is that something that's horrifying to think about? You want to pick up a pen cap that somebody's been using? No. And the reason being is because it has that detestable nature to it. But if we abhor what is evil, it helps us to be saved. We have to get that out of our life. Be terrified of it. If you're thinking about obeying the gospel this morning, do you hate what is evil? And if you've gotten to that stage in your life where you realize, I hate what is evil. I hate what it does. I hate what it stands for. I hate where it comes from. That's a very good starting point, and that's where we all have to start. But it also helps us in our growth. In 1 Peter 2, 1 and 2, is that we're supposed to be like newborn babes who desire the sincere, the pure milk of the word, that we may grow thereby. But the verse prior to that talks about removing these evil, horrible things from our life. If we are that way, and we receive this word like a newborn babe, it will help us to grow. Those babies want that milk, and they're going to let you know that they want that. And that's the only thing that's going to pacify and satisfy them at that moment. Same way with us as Christians when we cling to what is good and want those things. Hebrews 12 and verse 1 talks about running with endurance the race that's set before us. But you remember in that verse it also says that we're supposed to lay aside the weight and the sin which so easily ensnares us. All of these passages talk about not just our salvation, but our spiritual growth, and also the ability to endure that race comes from letting go, abhorring those things that are evil and getting them away from us. And if we don't have that spirit within us, it's going to hinder that process. So if you're not growing, ask yourself, is it because I have not yet learned to hate? Not to pretend to not indulge, to hate. To be horrified by it, to be disgusted by what is evil. If you're having trouble with endurance, that you go for a short period of time, but you stumble along the way, could it be that abhorrence of evil is not there? And the Bible gives us a lot of reasons for abhorring those things that are evil. You think about the fact that the devil himself is called the evil one. That Paul talks about, or Jesus talks about, this evil world that we live in. Paul calling it an evil and adulterous world that we live in. It is evil because of who it came from. Eating of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. It looked good. It was good for food, and it would make one wise like God himself, according to the devil. So what would be wrong with it? She should have been terrified of that tree. She should have heeded her own advice that she knew that she had received. We're not supposed to just not eat of it. Don't even touch it. because of who it comes from, we ought to hate it and be terrified of it. It challenges God's reign. If we fail to hate what is evil, evil causes us to love and serve the created other than the Creator. It causes us to think that we are gods. We are the ones who determine everything. We are the ones who decide what is evil and what is not. Because when it comes to this idea of evil, just because I don't like it, that's not what makes it evil. And just because I like it doesn't make it good. God's the one who determines that, not me. And so I can't worship at the altar of myself constantly. God is the one who belongs on that throne. This giving into evil, not hating evil, challenges who God is at his very core. It's something that brings immeasurable misery. You think about some of the basic sins in this world. Think about gambling. What does gambling do to a family? That families have been destroyed and made bankrupt because of someone in the family giving into gambling. Well, we may not have anybody who does that. What about drugs and alcoholism? What does that do? What about adultery and fornication? Lasciviousness. What does that do? All of these things, brethren, when we fail to hate them, cause immeasurable damage to families. There have been those who have had to deal with these problems as husbands and wives. And yet, even though they have dealt with the issue and the problem, the consequences linger. And they're still there for long periods of time. We should hate it, not just dislike it, but hate it. We go to a funeral, we see someone dead. You know why they're dead? Because sin's in the world. We see someone's home that's broken. You know why it's broken? Because sin is in the world. And it should cause us to hate it every time that we see it and be terrified of it. And because of that, the price that had to be paid is more than any mere human could ever pay. That God himself had to pay it. And Jesus Christ went through what he went through because of mankind not just pretending, but because mankind did not hate what is evil. Don't just not eat of the tree. Don't even touch it. Don't get near it. Don't be looking at it. Don't be fantasizing about it. Don't be jealous of those who might be near it, who have tasted the fruit. Don't be that way. We're to hate it and abhor it. The opposite of that, Paul talks about as well, that we are to cling to what is good. And you've probably heard this many times as well, that the word cling is a word that's used, the equivalent is used in Genesis 2, where it talks about a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined, or he will cleave to his spouse, to his wife. That it means to be glued together. But actually it's a medical term that talks about skin being stitched back together or glued back together, made one again. And so it's the idea not just of it being attached to one another, but so attached that it's indistinguishable from one another. It's cemented together. It is fused together. It is also used in the present tense, which means you're supposed to always be joining yourself to. Always be doing this. You know, in 2 Corinthians 6 and verse 16, or 1 Corinthians 6:16, Paul talks about someone being joined to a harlot. And said that a person that does that becomes one with them. It's not through that one act, but it's through that idea of being accepting of that other person. And so with marriage, it's the same way. It's not just about that physical act that the husband and wife rightfully and lawfully engage in. It's about them constantly being glued together in mind, in spirit, in purpose, in thought, in principle, in idea, in worship. It's about all of those things being joined together. And I believe that you can see this when you look at some other passages. There's not a lot of places in the New Testament where this word is used. One is in Acts 8 and verse 29, where you have this Ethiopian eunuch, and he's going through the desert, and Philip is told to go out and overtake this chariot. The Spirit says, go near and overtake this chariot. The word that is used there for overtake is the word that we're talking about here. Philip was to go near and not just outrun the chariot. Philip was supposed to go and join himself, as some versions have, join himself to this chariot. Why? Just so that he could prove how fast he had run, that he was able to have a communication with someone from another country? Was that the purpose? Or was the purpose so that the Spirit of God revealed through the Scriptures about who Jesus Christ is be revealed to this seeker of God so that he might obey the gospel? You remember that Philip had left an entire city where many, many people had obeyed the gospel. And God wanted him to go out there and find this one individual and join himself to that chariot. Go and sit with this man and teach him the gospel. He was to be devoted to that. Brethren, spreading the gospel is a good and worthy task. And the reason being is not just because we pretend to do it, not because we say, well, if I just set the good example, that's good enough, because it's not. We have to speak. We have to be about that business. We have to love that business. We have to join ourselves and submit ourselves to that business. The same way as Philip did with this chariot that he was with. Another one that we can learn from is Acts 9 and verse 26, where it talks about Paul coming back and he joined himself. He was trying to cleave to the disciples that were there. We don't just show up at a congregation. God is not asking you just show up at a congregation, at a church every now and then. Kind of associate with them and loosely be joined together with them. The same word that's used about marriage is the same word that's used here when Paul talks about joining himself to the disciples. It is a good thing, and this is why it's so important to be part of a congregation, because we have cemented ourselves together. It's going to be hard to break this bond the same way it's hard to break that bond in marriage. Because we have joined ourselves, we cemented ourselves, we have sewed ourselves, we have fused ourselves, we have integrated ourselves. We are one flesh in the body of Christ. Paul saw the importance of that. God demonstrated the importance of that. And these are some of those things we're supposed to love, cling to, enjoy, and understand the blessings of God as a result of. In Galatians 5, 22 and 23, right after Paul talks about the things that are the works of the flesh, he then talks about the fruit of the Spirit. And in this verse he says, but the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, long-suffering, kindness, here's our word, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control. And so the Bible tells us the things that not only some of the things that are evil, but things like that. But he also talks about these things that are good. And then he says, with these good things, there is no law against them. There's no law that says you love too much. There's no law that says you have too much joy. There's no law that says you're too long-suffering. There's no law that says you're too peaceful. You're too kind. You're too good. You're too faithful. God doesn't ever condemn that. Instead, he tells you cling to these things because these things are good. And so as we put those things into maybe a more practical setting, when you have that one simple verse, and that's probably one of the best verses to start with your children when they're young. Let love be without hypocrisy. Very easy to understand. Abhor, hate what is evil. Cling to what is good. When you start with something like that, that is a basic phrase, a very, very easy to understand and explain phrase. You can illustrate it through a lot of ways, even as we did this morning, when it comes to things that a person is scared of and they hate them because of that, and it's detestable, and things that a person would love and want to cling to and hold to and how valuable they are, and that it really means that you actually do hate this when you reject it, and it actually means you love this and you want to cleave to it whenever you accept it. But that sets a worldview that will help you as those children grow older. Because then there's a lot of discussions that will be only discussions and not arguments and fights with your children later on in life when you've started early with this idea and this principle. One of the things that this moral confusion that sometimes caused is they have to understand, and by this statement we understand that there is such a thing as objective evil and objective good. What that means is this. That means it does not originate with you. Because you like it does not make it good. Because you hate it doesn't make it evil. Because someone on television tells you it's good does not make it good. Because someone on television or Facebook or Twitter or somewhere else tells you it's evil does not make it evil. There's an objective standard. And the reason that is important is because it's not something that because I say it to you or I have to absorb it myself, does not make it personal then. That there's some personal reason I'm telling you this. The reason I'm saying that is wrong is because of something that's within me or something that I see in you. No, it's an objective standard. Romans 12 and verse 2 says that if we will indeed renew our minds, if we will indeed offer our bodies as living sacrifices, as it says in verse 1, and not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of our mind. Notice that it says, then you will be able to prove what is that good and acceptable and perfect will of God. That's the objective standard. Don't think like the world. Be transformed. You're no longer thinking like them. You're no longer thinking like it. You're no longer thinking that way any longer. You've been transformed. A completely new way of thinking. And that way of thinking is what proves the will of God and not the will of man. Objective faith is obtained by looking at the evidence that God has supplied and understanding what God says about that and accepting it as God's standard. Subjective means, let me think what I think about that. And here's what I think it means. Therefore, what I think it means is good, and what I think it means is evil. No, that's not objective. That's subjective. And when your children understand that, that means there's no bending of it anymore. Because God is the one who comes up with that distinction. In Jeremiah 10 and verse 23, and we looked at this several times in Gary's class when he was talking about what is sin. It is not in man who walks to direct his own steps. That is God's role. And you remember one of the reasons we're supposed to hate evil is because it challenges God's or authority to that throne. It means that we worship and serve the created rather than the creator. But in Jeremiah 10:23, you are not the standard. I am not the standard. Charlie and I, as the elders of this congregation, are not the standard. We don't draw that distinction. God does. We just enforce it. And that's the same way it is in each and every home. God is the one. So woe to those who call evil good and good evil. You're confusing the standard, and you make it hard for people to understand the difference between the two. And it means that if I can find someone to accept my point of view, then that makes it okay, and it doesn't. If the blind lead the blind, where are they both going to end up? So if you want to be in a ditch, then go by that. But woe to those who would call these things that are evil good, and even become so familiar with them that they're no longer horrified by it. I mean, think of how it is in our society. You know, as we were talking about in the classes, you know, you don't have to go that far back, 10, 15 years. And how it was that many people warned, we're on a slippery slope. Slippery slope. You accept homosexual marriage, guess what's coming next? Oh, that's a bunch of ridiculous talk. People are going to do what people do anyway. Where are we at now, brethren? Is there a slippery slope? And it started in the Garden of Eden. Because don't just not eat of it. Don't touch it. Stay away from it. That's where we're supposed to be. God is the one who decides that standard, not us. Good and evil are things that do not change. Jesus Christ is the same yesterday, today, and forever. The psalmist said in the verse that was read for us at the beginning in Psalm 119, 103, and 104, it's through God's precepts. My Bible hasn't been updated. God hasn't added anything to it. God's precepts are the same today as they were back then. Through your precepts. This is where he went for understanding, for guidance, for support. But he also says that because of this, I hate every false way. There are people who hate false ways when it comes to congregational doctrines that we hold to. And then in their private life, they don't hate it when it comes to the movies. They don't hate it when it comes to the music. When it comes to work, they don't hate it when it comes to how they do their taxes, how they have business dealings with other people. When it comes to politics as well, and yes, I'm going to mention it, it doesn't matter when it comes to that either. They want to put these things in little compartments. Brethren, to love the Lord without hypocrisy means you hate every false way. And you cling to what is good. It terrifies me. Does it terrify you when you see what's going on? Does it terrify you when you go in the store and you're trying to find a dress for your daughter and you can't find anything that would drop below her knees? Does that terrify you? Does it terrify you to think about your young daughter walking around with some clothing that has a word printed on the back of it? And then the whole world is supposed to not read it? Does it terrify you? Does it terrify you to think about your son marrying a woman that's not a Christian? Or your daughter marrying a young man that's not a Christian? Does it terrify you? Not something you think is good advice. Does it terrify you? Not something that you can find a reason to excuse it. Does it terrify you? Because if you set that standard now, it becomes only a discussion instead of a fight. Does it terrify you that your kids might not even know how to pray? Don't yet know the books of the Bible? Can't name the things that other 3-year-olds in their Bible classes are doing? Does it terrify you? If it does, then cling to what is good. Grab hold of what is good. And brethren, the more we cling to what is good, the easier it becomes to hate what is evil. That way, when the prom comes around, you don't have to have the same discussion that other people are having, that no, you're not doing that because of the dancing and the perversities that's going on. You don't have to have that discussion because your child has learned to hate what is evil, even if everyone else is loving it. Even if there's other brethren who are loving it, your child has learned to hate it because it violates God's principles. That's the discussion that we should be having. Instead of arguing about the minutiae of all these little decisions that are going on, the question ought to be, do you hate what's evil? Then you'll hate things that are like it. You'll hate the sticks that look like snakes. And you'll stay away from them. It becomes a lot easier. And life becomes a lot more joyful. But notice also that it's not just about choosing. Paul didn't say choose to not do evil and choose to do what is good, because doing that does not fit what God is demanding. It is abhorrence and it is clinging that God wants. There has to be an inner intensity that is there. Throughout the Old Testament, we've noticed these several times, especially over the past few months, like in Ezekiel 36 and verse 26, it talks about a new heart, a heart of flesh instead of a heart of stone. It says these things so many times because God is helping us to understand that having this heart of flesh is something that can be pricked. Brethren, I don't have a problem preaching or teaching something that makes you mad. I don't have an issue with that. I don't have an issue with something that I said this morning just made you just mad. I'm fine with that because it means your heart can be touched. It's when you say, that I've got a concern. When you say, well, and you move on. When you dismiss it, that's when I've got an issue because that's when God has an issue. Each and every one of us have to have a heart of flesh, that whatever it is that I have not yet learned to hate, I need to be about learning it. And that means there's something good out there that I'm not yet clinging to. There's something in that relationship I have with my God that I do not value yet, that I do not love, that I do not trust, that I'm not joined myself to Him in yet. And that means I can grow. That means I can continue to move on, and I can make it to heaven. But when I say, it's good enough, that's about as far as I want to go, that's when there's a problem. We have passages like Hebrews 3 and verse 12 where the brethren are warned because they're looking at going back into Judaism, many of them it seems. And he says, beware lest there be in any one of you an evil heart of unbelief in departing from the living God. And for them, it probably wasn't these huge sins, but it was a matter of they weren't willing to stand up and endure the temptations and the struggles and the persecution. And the Hebrew writer says that's an evil heart of unbelief. You're no different than the ones that marched all the way up to the borders of the promised land and then decided, we can't do it, we can't go in. And so again, parents, I'm going to pick on you again. You come all the way up to the point of saying, yes, these are some things I need to teach my child, but the world's going to do what the world does. And there's going to be these things they're going to encounter, and all their friends are doing it, and I don't want them to miss out on the things that all their friends are doing. You're no different than the ones who come all the way up to the borders of the promised land and say, we can't do it. Can't do it. And you're giving your child over to the world. And if we're honest with ourselves, we know that we as adults, those are the lines that we crossed along the way with ourselves. And every time we found ourselves in a bad place with God, it was because of that same reason. At that moment, we did not hate. We were not horrified. We were not disgusted by. There was not anything within me that says, I will not, because of what it means. I'm going to cling to what is good, and I'm going to trust in that. That's the relationship with the world and the things of the world that we're supposed to have. Hebrews 11 and verse 25, it makes no qualms about saying about Moses that he chose to suffer affliction with the people of God instead of enjoying the passing pleasures of sin. It is pleasurable. It is fun. You know, the reason that we get so mad at other people all the time is because we like it. We enjoy it. It feels good. We can pretend that it doesn't. But if it really was disgusting to me, you don't have to ask me over and over and over again to eat meatloaf. I'm not doing it. But when it comes to this anger thing, keep going back to it. You know the reason why? I don't hate it. I'm not disgusted by it. I'm not scared of it. I've become familiar with it. I know what it feels like to be angry. I'm used to it. I'm no different than the Egyptian slaves that came, or the Hebrew slaves who came out of Egyptian bondage. I know what it was like to be a slave. I'm not scared of being a slave. I've done that. I've been there. So I'd rather go back and eat onions and be a slave because I know what that's like. It feels familiar to me. I'm not horrified by it. Yeah, but they beat you. They did all these horrible things. It doesn't matter. I'm used to it. And so whatever it is in my life that I keep going back to, that's the reason I do it. I don't hate it. I don't abhor it. I know I'm supposed to, and so I'm just going to pretend. That's why the Bible says so often, do not be deceived. And what it's talking about there is, it's not telling you don't deceive others. Stop deceiving yourself. Stop being self-deceived. Stop pretending that this is where you're at. 2 Corinthians 3 and verse 18, and we looked at this a few weeks ago, where it talks about seeing the image of who Christ is with this unveiled face. The law for the Jew has been moved and taken out of the way, and he's able to see clearly who Jesus really is. And for us, the same idea is there, to see Jesus for who he clearly is. And then it talks about us being changed from one degree of glory to another. What it means is degree by degree, gradually and gradually, because you don't just wake up tomorrow. You can't just say to yourself today, I'm going to hate what is evil, and you automatically hate it. You have to build up that type of intensity. You have to work on that type of intensity. And the way that you work on it is, I want to be more like Jesus Christ, because hating what is evil is not enough. You'll burn yourself out. You will not feel fulfilled. And you'll struggle time after time with holding on to that pew in front of you when the invitation song is sung, until you finally fizzle out and just give up. You can't just hate. You have to love. You have to cling. Cling to the image of Christ, and you will change degree by degree until you feel that same image. God bless those of you who I've seen over the years that have done that very thing. That you had to come out of some hard and difficult circumstances and situations. And the reason that you did it is because you loved God. And the more that you loved God, the more you understood just how evil those things were. And it created such a hatred in you for those things that it horrified you not to even imagine who was that person who used to do that. And I'm not going to return to that again, ever, because it scares me too bad. And I'm not going to get around anything that even looks like it, even thing that seems like it may be, something that may be a gateway to that thing. I'm not going to do that because it scares me that much. Will not do it. That's why you have brethren who may have struggled with pornography, and so they just get rid of computers altogether. They have problems with gossip, and so they get off Facebook or Twitter or whatever else it is. That they have problems getting angry about the state of the world, so they turn off CNN and Fox News. Because we hate it. And I'm not going to let it separate me from my God. That's why it should scare us so badly. And so a question I'm going to leave with you this morning is genuine love hates evil. Psalm 97 in verse 10, to love the Lord is to indeed hate evil. And so the question I'm going to leave with you is that very one, is are you tired of pretending? Do you love God without hypocrisy? Is your love for God sincere? Remember, the word hypocrisy means acting like they would in a play. You put on a face. Do you genuinely hate it? Do you genuinely want to cleave to what is good? If that's where you're at this morning, if there's something that we can do to help you, if you need to obey the gospel and you want today to be the day that you start changing, let today be that day. Let us help you if we can. As together we stand and sing the song, won't you please come?